So this song actually talks about the opportunity to serve, so opportunité de servir, and also talking about seizing this chance. So, you know, when we have this opportunity to serve, how do we seize this chance? Excuse me, my daughter is interrupting this presentation, but the joys of Zoom. So I just wanted to welcome everybody, and I kind of wanted to share this video just to kind of, in a very brief synopsis, kind of talk about my own positionality, being born and raised in Central West Africa, which is where this song where it came from. So my first language is French, if you hear it. My parents are American. But long story short, this is the kind of spirit I was raised in, with music and song, and you know, and so that's really a big part of who I am, and the life that I lead. And so I wanted to start just by saying how grateful I am to have the opportunity to have these presentations. I know I say this often, and I just want to say it again. Thank you for coming. I know it takes a lot of courage to engage with these kind of topics. And, you know, as you know, if you don't experience discomfort during this presentation, that means I'm not doing my job. I always like to say that. So please do expect to feel uncomfortable. And some of the videos and footage that I will be showing, some of them may be triggering. I will give you some trigger warnings if I think that will be the case. And some of the videos will just be flat out uncomfortable. But the reality is this topic is uncomfortable. And so we have to learn how to navigate through that and how to work through that discomfort. And so I hope to be there and accompanying you through that, and we can talk as we go along. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. If you have any issues with technology, please reach out to Jeanette. She's helping me today. If you send anything via chat or raise your hand, I'm not going to be able to see it. So Jeanette will let me know what's happening on that end. All right, so let's get to the juicy part. Here we go. Share screen. All right. Just so everybody is aware of it, I am recording this presentation. So if at any point you're uncomfortable with that, just send me an email later to let me know. There is a possibility I will post it on YouTube on my Race Reality channel, just, you know, to share important information. So if anyone has an issue with that, you can either reach out to Jeanette or contact me, and I can, hopefully there won't be any faces on my screen, so nobody will be shown via video in that way. All right, and if for some reason you want to jump in and make a comment, please raise your hand and Jeanette will let me know. All right, so I like to start my presentations obviously with this quote. The reason why I like to start with this quote is that oftentimes, you know, I'm asked, why am I focusing on whiteness? Why am I focusing on discourses of society rather than focusing on the oneness of humanity? And so I just want to emphasize that these things go hand in hand, right? So the Guardian encourages us actually to educate ourselves and to understand the troubles and problems that really baffle the mind of man. And as you all know, racism and whiteness and white supremacy is one of those troubles. And, you know, as he says, it is the most challenging issue of the American Baha'i community. And so, so yeah. All right. Can somebody volunteer to read this quote, please?
I can read it.
Thank you.
How great, therefore, how staggering the responsibility that must weigh upon the present generation of the American believers to weed out, by every means in their power, those false habits and tendencies which they have inherited from their own nation.
Thank you, Roxana. So I start with this quote, and I start with a little bit of a background to white emotions, because I don't want to just jump into white emotions without giving a historical context to white emotions. And I start with this quote because I think it's quite revealing that the Guardian actually says inherited from their own nation, highlighted in red. And I want to emphasize that because often we forget the historical context within which white supremacy has been, as a system, right, has been implemented, and how we have inherited through generations white supremacy and whiteness. And so just briefly, I did want to give a pretty quick overview. So when we think about white supremacy, it's really an economic system, which people don't realize, that we have inherited as a nation. And the purpose of white supremacy was really to preserve the land, the wealth, and power that white men had accrued by colonizing North America, right? And so this system was based on the process of racialization, which is really the classification of people by the color of their skin and phenotypical differences. So what I want you to take away from this, really just briefly, is that we have inherited this as a nation, this idea of white supremacy. So this is a picture that was taken by Dorothea Lange. Some of you have already possibly seen it. It's called There's No Way Like the American Way. And in this picture, it depicts Black men and women in Louisville, Kentucky, lining up to seek food and clothing from a relief station in front of a billboard proclaiming world's highest standard of living. So this was taken during the Great Ohio River flood of 1937. So what I find interesting about this picture is how it clearly depicts, right, the advantages and resources the white collective that you see on the billboard are encouraged to accrue at the expense of the lives of people of color. And so we often like to talk about white privilege, but we don't necessarily always like to talk about the disadvantage that is taken away from people of color for the benefit of white people. And so as you see here, whites are being brainwashed through this idea of white racial ideology, right? That there's no way like the American way. So seeing this perfect, typical white family. So one, we're emphasizing this idea that the American way is the white American way. And then, and so I like to start here because I think that this is a really great implicit depiction of white supremacy, because often when we think about the system of white supremacy, we think about KKK. But really, white supremacy, the implicit system itself, is built on this whole brainwashing that our nation has gone through over time. And so just to emphasize, these inequities exist in all aspects of our nation's white supremacist system. So starting with the Supreme Court, that determined early on who was able to be called white and who wasn't, right? This was a question of law. Who gets to fall under the category of white? And therefore, who gets access to work? Because only white people had access to land and work opportunities. Who has access to resources. It creates also, because of these inequities, differences in standards of living, things such as redlining policies, right? If there are redlining policies that benefit white people, can people of color achieve this world's highest standard of living? No, it can't. And then, lastly, but there are a lot of other ones talking about this buddy system that happens, right? That happens in white golf clubs, right? You get to play golf with someone, it's the buddy system. You kind of rub elbows, they give you a job opportunity. All of these things give you access to this idea and this way, this world's highest standard of living in a very inequitable way. And of course, we can talk about healthcare disparities and all of these other things.
Liz, we do have a question for from Maymanat, what is an example of white emotion?
I'm gonna get to that, maybe I'm not. I have the whole presentation is on white emotions, but right now I'm just I'm just giving you a background information, so I'll get to that. Sound good?
And Kathy, I'd like to know what the buddy system is.
So I have a great video actually that I could maybe share later. So the buddy system, or I think there's another word for it. And sorry, my cultural literacy is showing here. But this idea of for example, at a job, let's say my white dad and your white dad are friends, and I run a company and he runs a company, right? So they're already buddies in that way. And so it's kind of like this idea of white collective looking out for each other. And so my dad's best friend is going to potentially hire me as a manager or give me some kind of job opportunity in an unfair way. This happens all the time, right? Even though they're technically supposed to, by now with the law, announce these job positions, oftentimes because of the buddy system, right? These job opportunities are given to friends of family and things like that, preserving this idea of resources within the white collective. And so what I want to emphasize here is that we have inherited this as a nation. I'm not here to prove this to you about white supremacy. This is historical fact and it's research. So there's a lot of research that has come out on white supremacy and whiteness. And so really my focus is white emotions, but this is just kind of like the background. I'm loving all these questions. All right, so what exactly have we inherited from our nation? So I introduced this idea of this white supremacist framework, and I wanna dig in a little bit deeper and talk about this visual diagram that actually one of my mentors, Cheryl Matias, had included in her book, Feeling White. And I've showed it in many of my presentations, but I think it's a great way to depict this idea of this white supremacist framework and to emphasize a couple things. So here, when you look at this, I'm gonna just give you 5 seconds to look at this diagram. So when we think about this framework, right, this white supremacist framework within which the system of white supremacy functions, it impacts whites and people of color differently. And so the way it impacts whites is through this idea of whiteness, which I'm going to get to in a minute and define. Whiteness is really this idea of racial ideology, which I'm also going to talk about in a minute. And then it often impacts people of color all the time through racism. And so the point I'd like to make here is that white supremacy and whiteness as a racial ideology is the disease, right? So it is the disease that is influencing, it's what we have inherited as a nation. Racism is the symptom of that disease. And so what often happens is that we focus on racism, which is the symptom, but we don't necessarily want to address the disease itself, which is whiteness and white supremacy. And so I'm going to define these terms a little bit because I find that people come into these presentations with different terms, different understandings of what the definition of terms are. So I'm just going to define a couple of them. So first, I just want to address that racism is different than prejudice. Racism really addresses this issue of power, right? So as a white person, I can be racist towards a person of color, but I'm sure you've heard this idea that people of color can't necessarily be racist towards white people. They can be prejudiced towards white people, which is, experiencing some kind of negative feelings towards another group of people, towards another person. That can be prejudice. It can go both ways. But in terms of the academic definition of racism, it includes this concept of power. And because when we think about this, within this white supremacist framework, who has power, who has access to health, who has access to wealth, who has access to resources, it's not really possible for people of color to be racist towards white people. So that's the first thing I wanted to emphasize. The second thing I wanted to talk about is whiteness, which is what we have inherited from our nation, right? And so talking about racial ideology. So first, the definition of ideology, I like to use Bonilla Silva's example of, or definition of racial ideology, where he talks about ideology being these broad mental and moral frameworks or grids that social groups use to make sense of the world, to decide what is right and wrong, true or false, important or unimportant, right? So kind of imagine them as these mental frameworks, these mental grids that we're all raised in, right? These filters that we use to guide, how we think, how we behave, the basic guidelines through which people filter information that can often be confusing, just to kind of make sense of their social reality. So that's what ideology is. Now, racial ideology specifically has to do with race, right? And so they're racially based frameworks that we've also learned. So there are different kinds of ideologies. You have patriarchy, for example, which is a type of ideology. But when we focus on racial ideology specifically, there are racially based frameworks that are used by people to either support the dominant status quo. So the dominant status quo in our country is this idea of whiteness, right? This white racial ideology that we perpetuate every day. That's the dominant status quo. Some people like to talk about anti-Black ideologies. That's another way that we can talk about it, but specifically one specific type of anti-Black ideology is whiteness, which is really the dominant one within our nation. Or a racial ideology can also be developed to challenge the dominant status quo, right? So if any of you are academics, or maybe you have heard of this, there's critical race theory, there's critical whiteness studies, which is what I study, right? Which are racial ideologies that really go against the status quo to kind of shed light on the inaccuracies of the dominant status quo, which is racial ideology. And so Omi and Winant, who are academics, talk about the ways racial ideology functions in our daily life. So for example, even though we don't necessarily realize it at a highly conscious level, but if we think about it, we will realize it, right? The ways that we make decisions in our lives about who we're gonna marry, what neighborhood we're gonna live in, right? Let's say what kind of hospital we're gonna go to, what kind of healthcare we're gonna seek, what school we're gonna let our children attend. All of these things are influenced by these different types of ideologies. And I like to think about this question: how does racial ideology affect our consciousness? Even like, how does racial ideology impact the way we interpret Baha'i writings or understand truth, right? And so we have inherited all of these, and I'm going to dig into it a little bit more, all of these different types of ideologies that merge together, including whiteness as a racial ideology. And then how does it affect us? How does it affect our consciousness? So I'm going to stop here real quick. I don't want to take too many questions because then we're not going to get through our presentation, but maybe if you can pick one or two.
Yeah, well, Howard would like to know if a wealthy and powerful Black person can be a racist, like Louis Farrakhan. And Jamie pointed out that Ibram Kendi says that is possible. So they'd like your perspective on that.
So, you know, there are a lot of books out there current that are very current at the moment. One of them, some books are Ibrahim Kendi's books. Another one I can think of is White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo. It's just like there are just too many issues there for me to address it during this presentation. What I can tell you, instead of thinking about racism specifically, what I can tell, because, you know, I think it's important to distinguish academic research and activist movements. And so oftentimes books that become really highly popular in activist settings and activist movements to get to short-term solutions are very different than what academics are looking at in terms of research and what the research is showing, how it's defined. You know, it's just more in a way systematic, and then also looking at long-term solutions. So I just wanted to kind of distinguish here. So I'm coming from an academic perspective, which is more long-term. And so saying that, what I do know is that you know, there's this saying that anybody can drink the Kool-Aid. So if we go back to this chart, you can see that whiteness impacts people of color, and people of color can impact whiteness. And what that means is that everybody drinks the Kool-Aid, right? So people of color can support, like some of my most vicious attacks have come from people of color who didn't want me to be rocking the boat, right? And so in many ways, their behavior was very much in a way to try to sustain the kind of advantages and resources that they have accrued within the system. But that doesn't mean that the way they embody whiteness is the same as the way a white rich person embodies whiteness, or is not, or a poor white person. You know, there's kind of like a spectrum in terms of the kind of level in which you're benefiting from these resources of whiteness. And I think Clarence Thomas is a really good example of a person of color who supports and embodies a lot of the different aspects of white ideology to benefit him and to benefit the system, the white supremacist system within which he is invested, right? And so when we think about investment and what people want to choose to give up to buy into whiteness and to have access to these resources and this wealth at the expense of people of color, that's how I like to think about it. And so I'm glad you brought up this question, because oftentimes people confuse or conflate this idea of talking about white people. There are a lot of, it's just a way of talking, but really what we're trying to say is that anybody who really embodies and takes on this white ideology can fall under that umbrella. I don't know if that was helpful. All right. Are we good?
Yeah, no additional comments.
Okay. So the next thing I wanted to talk about, so I kind of defined what racial ideology was. And so I wanted to ask this question, right? So how is whiteness and white racial ideology perpetuated within our framework, within this white supremacist framework, within our day-to-day life, right? Because it's easy to talk about racial ideology, but it's hard to see the ways, the insidious ways it functions in our day-to-day lives. And so I just want to show this board, this advertising billboard. Just take 5 seconds to look at it real quick. A few things that you're going to notice. You're going to see the phrase, "It's the American way." You're going to see freedom of religion, speech, opportunity, private enterprise, representative democracy. What else do you notice? Just unmute yourself and just name a few things.
The white hand.
The white hand.
Holding the hat.
Okay.
Emphasis on materialism. Manufactured.
Sorry, Anne, go ahead. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
I
Yeah.
was- Sorry, I was just making the connection of manufacturers with materialism.
Okay, great. So we're looking at materialism. Okay. Anything else? What's the date on this picture?
1940.
1940. What is the historical context of it? What historical context are we in when we're for this billboard?
World War II.
World War II. What is the actual state of affairs in terms of race relations in the country in 1940?
Jim Crow, segregation.
Jim Crow and segregation. So is this billboard targeting people of color?
No.
Okay. And so, you know, we can begin to dissect, but what I really want to focus on is how the racial ideology, how whiteness is perpetuated. So if you notice the phrase, it's the American way, what is wrong with that phrase within the historical context within which this billboard exists?
Does not apply.
I'm sorry?
It doesn't apply to Black people.
It doesn't apply to Black people, right? And so one of the ways in which whiteness and white ideology is perpetuated and becomes hidden and insidious and masked is that we don't actually label the term white when it's really meant for white people, right? This billboard should say it's the white American way, because they're essentially, in our minds, without us realizing it, we're equating American to white. And that's what they want us to do without actually explicitly saying this. And so this is a type of brainwashing that happens, right? We know that opportunity in 1940 is not for all Americans, but they're not actually going to state that, right? It's only for white Americans. And this idea of private enterprise, this idea of freedom, who does it apply to? It applies to white Americans, but it's not stated that way. And so when you say something like, oh, you know, like this opportunity wasn't for people of color, a white person's going to turn around and be like, yes, it was for everybody. This country, all opportunities are for everybody, because this is how whiteness has brainwashed them, because it wasn't explicit in the way in which opportunities were handed out, right? And so my point here is to really think about the ways in our everyday life to start asking the questions that we're not asking because we think that it's normal. We think that it's normative. We think that it's, you know, why ask? We don't even think to ask it because we assume this normativity about the way things are. And that's how insidious whiteness and racial ideology works. And that's how we're lied to. And so I like a really great documentary, and I'm sure many of you have watched it. It's called The Color of Fear. And I think that it does a really good job of explaining this idea, you know, where the white, I don't remember the characters' names, the people's names, but this white person keeps saying, but I don't understand why you just can't come over to our side. Why don't you just work hard? We're giving you the opportunities. Why can't you just come over to our side? Why can't you just assimilate with white people? And what's really frustrating, and you can see this in the Black man, in the way that he reacts to this white person's comments, is that they actually can't, right? We keep saying, well, we're going to just give you the resources and the opportunity, just assimilate, just do it and work hard and get the same jobs. But the reality is the way this white supremacist framework works is that these opportunities and resources are specifically for white people. And so even if you want Black people to assimilate into white spaces within the white supremacist framework, it is very difficult to do that. They can't just assimilate because you're never going to let them. The system is never, through structural, institutional racism, right? Redlining policies, disparities in healthcare, all of these things do not allow the assimilation or, you know, the equitable distribution of resources that we're made to believe happens through this idea of brainwashing and whiteness and white ideology. And so, you know, I think it's important, if you're going to leave, if you're going to take anything away from this presentation, is to understand that in many ways we are brainwashed in a way to think that it's possible when we know that it's not. There's no assimilation possible when structurally and institutionally the system is designed to separate and to other anybody who does not fall under the white category legally. And this is what we have inherited as a nation, and this is what I want to come back to over and over again, right? This is what we have inherited as a nation. And it's dangerous, and it's the cause of death, which we're going to talk about as well.
We have another comment. You tell me if you want more, or if you want to move on. And
okay. Go ahead. You can just make the comment, and then if I feel like it'll be addressed later, we'll move on.
Okay. Well, it's actually, so Jamie says he's also interested in the way manufacturing is conflated with government. What does freedom of religion and speech have to do with manufacturing?
Thanks, Jamie. Thanks for bringing that up, right? And so this has a lot. This is something to really think about. How white supremacy as an economic system, right? How is it benefiting? And what does that have to do? So that's also part of the brainwashing. Thank you for bringing that up. So one of the ways in which racial ideology is perpetuated, so, you know, when I talk about racial ideology, I'm just going to use the term whiteness, and I'm just going to assume everybody now kind of understands that whiteness equates racial ideology. It doesn't equate white bodies. It doesn't equate the term white. Whiteness is actually a racial ideology, which is often the misunderstanding that happens. And so one of the ways whiteness is perpetuated, right? Because within this white supremacist framework, the whole purpose of racial ideology is propaganda, right? To keep the system going as is. And so to be able to keep the system going as is, there are specific elements that happen that have been documented through research, through the literature. And so one of them is this idea of colorblind ideology, which in some ways there's been a lot of pushback against colorblind ideology, but I do want to emphasize a few things because it's still alive and well. It's just that because of the way whiteness functions and the way it's insidious, it's now kind of adapting, right? This colorblind ideology is adapting and merging so that people kind of sound woke, but they're not really woke, because nobody now is going to be like, I don't see color. You know, there's been so much pushback about when people say, oh, I don't see color, everybody is the same, that people aren't going to say that anymore because it's not politically correct. But that doesn't mean that colorblind ideology isn't alive and well. It just means that it's morphed again and it's changing. But there are certain aspects to this idea of colorblind ideology which supports and perpetuates and keeps this white supremacist framework in place. So this idea that we are all equal, right? Without understanding the historical context, we know that the system is not designed equally. It's not designed to be equitable for everybody. It's designed to hoard resources for white people. And so when we say we are all equal, we're actually supporting and perpetuating this white supremacist framework by hiding the fact that the system is inequitable, right? When we say something like that. So here I'm trying to get at how this ideology really supports this white supremacist framework. Another one is this idea of I don't see color, which I think is just ironic. And I know most people don't do this anymore, but if we think about it, for you to feel the need to say I don't see color, you have to see color, which is just mind-boggling, right? I don't see color. Race doesn't matter anymore. And we want people to think within this white supremacist framework that race doesn't matter anymore, because we want people to believe that is not an issue anymore because it's become implicit, right? We moved from white supremacy being explicit, KKK, which is now deemed a terrorist organization, right, to a more implicit form of whiteness and white supremacy that has to do with criminalization, you know, incarceration rates, the inequities and incarceration rates, and all of these things. And so the system is not equal, but when we say that and we're taught to say it, right, we're brainwashed to say it, is really to support this idea of the white supremacist framework. I don't see color is the same thing. Hold on, let me finish my thought and then you can interrupt. So this other concept, aspect of colorblindness, which we don't really talk about a lot, is this idea of storylines, which again have been documented, and enough people repeat these storylines to know that it's not just an individual actually sharing a story. It's actual stories that have been taught to white people through white racial ideology to pretend like, you know, everything is fine and there's equity when it's actually inequitable. So it's actually present to mask the inequities that are happening. And so one of them is, for example, you know, I've heard a lot and I've been attacked many times. What do you mean? I come from a family of immigrants. They came to this country, they worked hard, they made something out of themselves, and we made it. So why can't Black people make it? And so this storyline, among many others, right? This is just an example that I find useful. We forget that the Supreme Court deemed who was white. And so if you're immigrant family, so when the Irish and the Italians first arrived in this country, they did not fall under the white umbrella. I don't know if everybody knows this. And so over time, to suit the purposes of the government, specific immigrant groups were then added within that umbrella, right? People went to court and they tried to prove whether they were white or not white, right? So there are all of these, from a legal perspective, there are all of these historical cases that we're trying to prove. And this is where a lot of people don't know this, scientific racism came in, right? They were trying to prove in different ways or make the argument in court as to who was deemed, who could be white. So it could be, you know, from your ancestry, who came from the caucus. That's where the term Caucasian comes from, or the size of the skull of your head, right? So all of these different arguments arose and was very confusing. And you can, you know, there's a ton of books out there on the law that really explain the dynamics of how people who arrived in this country were actually fighting to be considered under the umbrella white. So it's not biological, right? It's the socially constructed term. And historically, it was designed to hoard resources, land, and wealth and power. So those are examples of storylines. Semantic moves are the speech that we talk about. So I'm sure a lot of you have done this, and I have too, and I still do it sometimes, and I don't realize it because it's racial ideology has been taught. We've been taught to use these tricks, right? So for example, the most common one is, I'm not racist, but, right? So it's a semantic move in the sense that I'm going to talk about race in a non-racial way. So I'm going to say, I don't want to live in this neighborhood because I think it's dangerous. But what you're really saying is, you're saying something racist in a non-racial way. What you're really saying is, I don't want to live in this neighborhood because there are a lot of Black people that live in this neighborhood, and I'm going to equate Blackness with criminality, right? But we're not actually going to say that. And so there are a ton of ways in which, through racial ideology, we've been taught to perpetuate racism and racist ideologies without ever actually stating or saying the word race or Black or white, right? And we do it in our day-to-day talk all the time. That's another aspect of colorblind ideology. And I wanted to use colorblind ideology as an example before we move into white emotions, because colorblind ideology is just one element of the ways that the research shows of the ways in which the white supremacist framework is supported. White emotions is another one, which I'm going to get to in a minute, and that's the purpose and focus of our presentation. Jeanette, one or two quick questions or comments? I thought I heard you interrupt, but I wasn't sure.
Yeah, no, it's fine. There's a bit of a conversation going on around this question in the chat, but
Okay.
I'll put it anyway, which is, are things still the same today? Can Blacks vote, go to college, start businesses, and get jobs? And you touched a little bit on that implicit bias and the way the systems are.
Yeah. So, you know, what I want people to get out of this is, even though I'm talking about this within a historical context, I think what's important to understand is that, you know, the way whiteness functions is that it's insidious. So it adapts and morphs with the system, right? So maybe it's not explicit anymore where, you know, there's Jim Crow laws, but there are different ways within this, but the system has adapted to ensure that white people still have the power, and to kind of give this impression that, you know, because that's the whole point of racial ideology. How do you mask it? How do you hide it? And how do you perpetuate this false impression that everything is okay, that everything's equal, that life is great, right? For everybody, when really it's not for everybody. Does that make sense? Jeanette, is that good, or do I need to emphasize anything else?
I think that's good. We have some more comments about how, do you want me to share some of them?
Sure, yeah.
Okay, so Ella says she can't say it hasn't gotten better right on the surface, but Blacks still are arrested, jailed, longer sentences, profiled, hung, and murdered before our eyes. Just because you dress something up does not mean the soul and spirit of it is empty.
Thank you, Ella. That's really important. Thank you for making that point. I agree 100%.
And voter suppression, Georgette brought up voter suppression, which is a big issue right now, a big part of the conversation.
Yeah. And I'm not like fully versed on the whole voter suppression issue. And so maybe if it's something, Georgette, that you want to bring up at the end, that would be great. Thank you for bringing that up. All right, so are we ready for white emotions? Woohoo! So another way in which the system, this white supremacist framework, is sustained and perpetuated, right, is through the employment of white emotions. So anything that you've learned about white emotions through white fragility, I just want you to forget for this presentation, because I'm not going to be using it. I'm not going to be addressing it. It's a concept that was brought up by one academic. It doesn't encompass this idea of white emotions. So I just want to put that out there. Don't equate white emotions with white fragility, because they're not the same thing. White emotions is like a whole subfield of critical whiteness studies. And there's a lot there to unpack. So white emotions, the point that I want to make is that white emotions are strategic, right? We've been taught, there's actually this really great book that's on my bookshelf somewhere, that's by Sarah Ahmed, and it's called The Cultural Politics of Emotion, I think it's called, which really talks about how emotions are political in the way that we employ them. And so the way we employ white emotions benefits this white supremacist framework. So how are white emotions employed as a tool to sustain white supremacy? And we're going to talk about that, but this is really the question that I'm going to engage in this part of the presentation. How are we employing it as a tool to sustain white supremacy? I just want you to think about it just for a second. Many of you are familiar with this video, and we're going to watch it. I want you to pay attention to her emotions. And I want you to think about this question while you watch the video. How is Amy Cooper employing white emotions to sustain white supremacy?
please stop?
Can everybody hear that? Sorry, I don't know what I just did.
Yeah, the audio is good.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. Hold on. Not working.
Would you please stop? Sir, I'm asking you to stop.
Please don't come close to me.
Sir, I'm asking you to stop recording me.
Please don't come close to me.
Please take your phone off.
Please don't come close to
And
me.
I'm taking a picture and calling the cops.
Please call the cops. Please call the cops.
I'm going to tell them there's an African-American man threatening my life.
Please tell them whatever you like.
Excuse me? I'm sorry, I'm in the Ramble, and there is a man, African-American, he has a bicycle helmet. He is recording me and threatening me and my dog. There is an African-American man, I am in Central Park. He is recording me and threatening myself and my dog. And my... I'm sorry, I can't hear you either. I'm being threatened by a man in the Ramble. Please send the cops immediately. I'm in Central Park in the Ramble. I don't know.
Thank you.
I just want to replay something real quick. I want you to note how her tone
He is recording
changes.
me and threatening myself and my dog. And my... I'm sorry, I can't...
Now, do you notice how her tone changes? She's changing she's noticing that she's not getting the reaction that she needs. And so her tone changes right here with the cops. I mean, we're going to talk about the whole video, but I do want to note this.
I'm being threatened by a man in the... I'm sorry, I can't hear you either. I'm being threatened by a man in the Ramble. Please send the cops immediately. I'm in Central Park in the Ramble. I don't know.
Thank you.
So before we discuss this video, I just wanted to make a few points so that we're really focusing on this idea of white emotions as a tool that is employed. I want you to think about the historical perspective, right? Because we've inherited white ideology over a few centuries. And from a historical perspective, I want you to think about what is happening. You have a Black man that has politely asked a white woman to leash her dog. That's really all that happened, right? A Black man asking a white woman to leash her dog. So first of all, this white woman was breaking the law, right? She wasn't following the rules. And so historically, through this idea of white supremacy, right, and white racial ideology, white people and white women feel that they are entitled, they are above the law in many cases, right, where they use the law for their purpose. And so when we think about this video, the first thing I want to address is the historical context of this white woman, a Black man asking her to do something, so telling her that she's not doing something right. So right there, I want you to think about this idea of white entitlement, right? That we often think that we're above the law in the sense that we can just kind of break the law and it's not a big deal, whatever, you know, or maybe they'll tell me, maybe the cops will come and tell me to put a leash back on my dog. But the fact that a Black man, right, told this white woman, it created specific emotions, kind of like, how dare you tell me that I'm doing something wrong? Like, how dare you tell me to do something when I feel like I'm entitled to breaking the law, or, you know, I have the authority to do so because I'm white, even though it's not explicitly said. When we think about it from a historical perspective, and I want to talk about Emmett Till, right? Because this is we could parallel these two instances. Unfortunately, a white woman a white woman feigning this idea of being attacked or needing help and lying and using her white emotions led to the brutal murder of Emmett Till. And there was no video, right? There was no video of the brutal murder of Emmett Till. There was no video of the white collective asking the white woman involved until later, right? When she confessed that she was lying. We didn't have any of it. But the way the white emotions are employed to sustain and put people in their place, right? So she was hoping to put this black man in his place with the way that she employed her white emotions by calling the cops. And so I do want to put it within a historical perspective before we start talking about the emotions themselves. So would anybody like to share or add to what they noticed in the video in terms of white emotions? So these are kind of like the, oops, sorry. Hold on. This white authority and white entitlement. So so like if you can just, you know, unmute yourself and kind of share what kind of emotions was Amy Cooper employing and what the purpose was of those emotions. What did they serve?
This is Jamie. The thing that I noticed is that her tone changed really quick from when she was talking with Kristen Cooper directly before she called, and then suddenly she was in near tears and expressing fear that wasn't present when she was speaking directly with Kristen Cooper. It seemed like she was expressing anger.
Thank you. So we have white anger, right? Before the phone call.
This is Bart.
Hey, Bart.
I would like to say that I see this as an intentional and violent act because this woman was so adept at doing it. And she also did so in full recognition of what the ramifications might be for this black man who, ironically enough, was a soft-spoken bird watcher. That she did so regardless of what the ramifications could be, which could ultimately have been his death or certainly his imprisonment, the loss of his job. And so how fitting that that she lost her job and even her dog over this.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Because you know, we could say that it was attempted second-degree murder, right? When we think about this within a historical context and we understand the way policing works, she was actually using her understanding of policing and how the police force works to her advantage. Thank you. And so what were some of those emotions that she was displaying? There was white anger. What else? White fear.
Yeah. She was very aggressive at the beginning. She was right up in his face with her phone.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Righteousness.
Roxana, can you say that again?
Righteousness.
Righteousness. Sorry.
Even sexual undertones, considering the history of and fear of the black man raping the white women.
Yep. 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 Anything else?
And indignation. She, you know, she was, I think it fueled her anger and her reaction that the black man was so calm.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, and basically challenged her but in a, you know, very calm way. Okay, call the police. Please do call the police. And I think she, you know, in addition to the anger and the, I think she felt this indignation. How dare he challenge me?
And would she
I'm
have
white,
felt the
he's
same
a
way?
black man.
Would you have felt the same way if it was a white man or a police officer? How dare?
Probably not.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, she felt, you know, there's a black man attacking me, and she repeated, you know, a black man. I mean, Central Park. It's like the description and the definition was that it's almost like her blindness was acting out all of those emotions, and she could not open her heart to see the human speaking to her. It didn't move her at all. She just completely bought into her fear and into her beliefs.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
There's
I,
also
I also saw the quintessential white tears.
Yeah, white tears. Yep. Jeanette, did you want to add something?
yeah, there was also a discrepancy, right, between her behavior and what she was saying, because a person who's in fear doesn't approach the person who is threatening them, and in fact she threatened him when she said she's going to call the cops and let them know that an African American man, she was putting him directly in his place. Elga shared that she's seen this display in many different variations. How dare you refuse our beautiful handouts that are good for you? How dare you make me uncomfortable? How dare you question my decisions?
Yep. And so just to kind of follow up on what Elga is saying, I want us to dig a little bit deeper, okay? So was Amy potentially feeling shame about knowing that she was doing something wrong and didn't want to take responsibility for it? And so if she doesn't want to take responsibility, right, she feels this shame because she's been essentially caught in the act of, breaking the law, doesn't want to take responsibility for it because she feels entitled, right? And so what happens? She employs emotionalities and projects it onto somebody else, specifically the Black male. And this happens all the time. And so, oftentimes we employ emotionalities when white people, they're called racist. They're like, how dare you call me racist? Blah, 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 right? They kind of unleash this anger and rage. What I want us to start acknowledging and to think about, even when we feel these own emotions as white people, right? To just dig a little bit deeper and to say, okay, why am I reacting this way? What am I trying what am I trying not to acknowledge, right? What am I trying not to take responsibility for? Am I feeling shame about the fact that, maybe they are stating the truth? Maybe I am racist. Maybe I did do something. And so to think about how we employ these emotions, one, to cover up our own shame in our complicity to white supremacy, and also how these emotions are employed so then to project it onto somebody else, right? So that we don't have to deal with it. And this is a really insidious way in which racial ideology, we've learned these behaviors. And so it's an insidious way in which racial ideology is perpetuated because we don't ever deal with our shame and guilt. We just project it onto other people, right? And so to really think about that in our own behavior, I just encourage everyone, as you experience these emotions in your day-to-day lives, to think about, okay, what purpose are these emotions serving in the moment? Why am I experiencing them? And why do I want to project onto other people? Specifically people of color.
Are you able to speak a little bit to so we have a question about her objection to being filmed and why then he would insist on filming her, that maybe that was triggering for her. There's a bit of a conversation going around this also. Georgette commented that filming is one of the few defenses that Black individuals have. If you have anything to add.
No, I mean, I think Georgette is saying it all. They don't want the truth to be out there. Or, I mean, this is the reality that we live in, right? If we're not taught, I think what's important to also add that within this white supremacist framework and the way racial ideology functions is that we're not taught to own up, right? We're not taught to own up to the fact that we're complicit, for example. If anything, the way racial ideology functions and to sustain white supremacist framework is not to acknowledge it, right? To continue with the lies, with the brainwashing, to project onto other people so that, it's seen, we can project this idea of being equitable or, anti-racist or whatever other, fancy terms are out there right now. But deep down, we're not addressing them. And so for me, asking not to be video recorded, I mean, I think she lost that right when she started going off on him. I'm sure he wouldn't have started recording if he hadn't noticed that the emotions were already right there. We don't know what happened right before he started recording. And so it is for protection. Think about all the instances in which if we had video, we don't even know if we had video, these modern day lynchings, right? That this is how we're talking about them, the murder of George Floyd, that was a modern day lynching, which we're going to talk about in a minute. If there wasn't video, think about all the lynchings, violent lynchings that have happened through the police force, and how white people, not just the police force, but how white people have utilized the police force to do the lynching, white women specifically, right? So,
Liz,
yeah.
I just wanted to add this, a lot of discussion about filming. And I had a racist remark said to me in the dentist office, which I told you about.
Mm-hmm.
But the idea here was from a white hygienist, if the police just had a way to turn off all of the phones around them, then these films wouldn't be made and we wouldn't have to worry about all this. I just wanted to throw that comment in.
Yeah. Thank you.
And just to clarify, that film did start in the middle of the interaction. There was another comment that it seemed like he started filming at the beginning of the conversation, but he had already asked her to leash her dog, and she wasn't doing that. When he started filming, she was already in a state of stress or was exhibiting those symptoms.
Thank you. So, what I do want to emphasize, this idea of racialization, which is the